Hello and welcome to the webinar on the role of cover crops in organic transitions by Brian McSpadden Gardner of The Ohio State University. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. We're a community of cooperative extension service personnel, researchers, ag professionals, organic certifiers, and practitioners. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and our many recorded webinars on organic farming topics on our website at extension.org/organic_production. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce today's speaker. Dr. Brian McSpadden Gardner works as a plant pathologist and microbial ecologist at the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center, where he also directs the Organic Food Farming Education and Research Program. His research focus on the influence of microorganisms on soil and plant health, particularly in organic systems.
And today I'd like to go ahead and let you know that I will be available after this seminar as well to discuss topics related to cover crops and also microbial inoculants, which will be covered as part of today's seminar. And more information can be found on my lab website there. So today's talk I'm going to break down into 4 subtopics, and the first I'm going to focus on the resources that are already available and published on cover crops and their use in organic agriculture. The first place that I highly recommend people go to is, in fact, the extension resources that are available, as Alice pointed out. And if you simply point to cover crops in the search box, you'll find that there's over 726 resources already available. So this is a real rich resource for information on cover crops and organic systems. And I'd particularly like to highlight, for those of you who perhaps don't have a lot of experience already with cover cropping, to go to the articles under cover cropping and organic farming systems, where you'll find a series of fact sheets related to the different uses, different types, and applications of cover crops and what they can do for you. Another really useful resource comes from the Sustainable Ag Research and Extension Network, and you can get these both as hard copy books or as online PDF files. The first is called Managing Cover Crops Profitably, and a good companion to that is crop rotation on organic farms. Because one of the take-home messages about cover crops is that they really are, from an ecological perspective, an integral part of crop rotation, and their benefits that can be ascribed to cover crops are not unlike those that can be ascribed to other rotational crops. The Managing Cover Crops Profitably has a large number of charts that are really good quick references to figure out what types of cover crops might work best in your system. As we all know, conditions on farms differ dramatically, not only from region to region, but also from different locations, even on the same farm. The needs that you have for your cover crops in terms of ecological function may vary. So, for example, in some cases you may have compaction problems, and having a subsoiler such as radish can be very helpful, where things like oats don't provide the benefit that you might need. Alternatively, if your primary issue happens to be weeds, working with one of the non-leguminous cereal crops may be the best approach for you in that particular location. In addition to picking out cover crops based on the advantages, one has to pay attention to the downsides of using particular cover crops. And again, in that reference, there are a number of handy charts that talk about the disadvantages of those particular cover crops. And again, I don't have time to go over all of these resources, but they do allow you to find a combination of cover crops that have the functions that you need for your farm. I will take a few minutes, though, to summarize the benefits of using cover crops during the transition period to certified status, and then also talk a little bit about the risks of using cover crops. For those of you who are transitioning from conventional to organic agriculture, you may not have much experience with cover crops, or you may have had passing experience with one or two cover crops that have been previously tried in your area. And what I'd like to point out is in the last 10 years or so, there's been a real synthesis of hundreds of research projects in the area of cover crops. And again, those workbooks that are provided by Sarah are an excellent starting point to finding the resources that will help you manage your cover crops effectively so that the downside problems that some novice cover croppers experience can be avoided easily. So what are some of the main benefits? Well, the first has to do with soil fertility and building soil quality. As we all know, balanced fertility is good for cash crops and tends to be bad for weeds. We have a situation here in Northeast Ohio where there's some certified organic land that, because of past history, has very high phosphorus levels, far exceeding the requirements of the crop. And because of that, ragweed, giant ragweed, is a perennial problem there. Cover crop legumes, of course, can provide additional nitrogen if low soil fertility is an issue on your soils. But cover crop roots may also stimulate greater availability of phosphorus if it is otherwise unavailable. Applications of rock phosphorus, of course, take time to break down to soluble forms, but the more roots you have per unit time, per unit area of land, the more soluble phosphorus will be available within your agroecosystem. With regards to soil fertility, again, if you are transitioning from conventional to organic agriculture, it is an opportune time to assess your needs in a very systematic way. This can be done in the spring prior to planting or the fall post-harvest. The standard battery of macronutrients should be part of that test. Particular attention can be paid to the calcium-magnesium ratios, which are important in certain soils, and the soil organic matter, which of course is very important to the overall productivity of a soil managed organically. And of course, pH and micronutrients shouldn't be ignored, and appropriate lime materials are available for organic agriculture. I highly recommend that you invest in an expert testing service. These are often available at local land-grant colleges of agriculture. Sometimes local testing services in the private sector will be recommended by county extension, and there is an online fact sheet that discusses how you can sample and test your soils very effectively. One of the most commonly discussed advantages of using cover crops is for weed suppression. Now, weeds are the notorious bane of organic agriculture because the convenience that's offered by chemical herbicides is disposed with under the organic mindset. And for those of you who are transitioning, this will probably be your greatest challenge to change the relationships that you have between your crops and your land and how you manage those weeds. Cover crops compete with weeds for soil, water, nutrients, and light. So obviously, if you have your land covered with a crop that you are planting, weeds will be less of a problem more of the time. You can kill cover crops to create a mulch that can suppress weeds through allelopathy. Ryegrass is a very commonly used for this purpose. Buckwheat and tillage radish also have allelopathic qualities to them. Here we have a picture of one way of managing the rye cover crops through a process called rolling. And this can be used if you have good stands of rye or rye vetch or rye mixed with some other legume. And it is useful for suppressing small seeded dicots and other annual weeds. However, you should be cautioned that if your main weed problems are deep-rooted perennials, particularly thistle and giant ragweed, rolling will not offer the level of weed management that it could in other situations. Pest and pathogen suppression is also one of the main purposes for using cover crops. As I mentioned before, you have this rotation effect where by planting a plant species that is not a normal host for your cash crop pathogens and pests, you are essentially debilitating their populations by starving them out of possible food supplies. So using cover crops in effective rotation can help reduce pest and pathogen levels. But you have to pay attention to the spectrum of host range of both the diseases and the pests in your area. The mulch effect that you get from crimping and rolling rye and other cereal crops can also prevent splash dispersal of soil-borne pathogens. But again, what you need to be aware of is you need to have a good stand of that rye, and recommendations on the order of 4 tons per acre of stand biomass is a guideline that you should use for determining whether or not the rolling effect is going to provide sufficient cover to get that beneficial mulch effect. You'll find in a lot of places a discussion of biofumigation. There are a number of brassica and mustard species that release glucosinolates. However, when they decompose, this is a fairly short-lived toxic effect, and there's a lot of data that now indicates that what the real benefit is primarily ascribed to changes in soil microbiology, which occur over days and weeks and even months in response to planting of these cover crops, not unlike the changes that you would see with other crop rotations. The general rule with regards to microbial suppression is that when you get first incorporation of fresh organic matter, there's a flush of mycelial growth, which means that you're going to typically have greater pathogen pressure because most plant pathogens are in fact fungi and oomycetes, these mycelial organisms. But once they have had first dibs on the decomposition of the fresh organic matter, then the bacteria, which tend to suppress these parasites of plants, also bloom, and the soil comes back into balance in about a 3 to 5 week period, depending on the prevailing moisture and temperature conditions. So those are the upsides of using cover crops during transitioning. What are the downsides? Well, first of all, and most importantly, you really have to plan the timing of your cover crop planting and harvest relative to the needs of your cash crop. You need to be sure that the rotation of the cover crop fits into your growing season, and you want to avoid late harvest of your cash crop that would delay cover crop planting, because if you end up with a low stand, you don't get the benefits that were just described. You don't get the same degree of breakage of the hard pan with the tillage radish. We had 1 year here on station where we were unable to plant due to weather delays until late September, and our tillage radish never got past the 4-leaf stage by the time we had hard freezes, and so the growth of the roots was limited to about 3 inches and only about 1 inch thick per plant before there was winterkill. This past year we were able to plant in early September, and we got a great stand, and we were able to really fill up the soil with the very thick root of the tillage radish, such that there was essentially no visible soil surface in those fields where we planted the tillage radish. So having proper timing of planting of your cover crop is important to establishing strong stand, and that will determine the success of the cover crop for the following cash crop. You also want to avoid early harvest, which can limit your cash crop yields, because if you focus only on the timing of the planting of the cover crop, then you may not get as much harvest, particularly of indeterminate vegetable crops, that you might otherwise get. In the springtime, you need to be thinking about the timing of the cover crop kill relative to the cash crop planting or transplanting. And this has to do with the fact that how you kill and when you kill your cover crop affects the soil microbial community in a way that will affect the ability of the cash crop to establish itself. You need to accumulate sufficient cover crop biomass to attain the desired benefits. As I mentioned before, you need about 4 tons per acre of rye if you're going to roll it to get good disease control. So you want to let it grow long enough, and you also need to get it to a developmental stage where it will actually break when you roll it. If you try to roll it too early, it can spring back up, and you've just gone through and wasted that diesel fuel for naught, because you're going to have to go back through again if you want to get that carpet of rolled rye. You also want to make sure that you destroy the green bridge. This is a term that's used because, again, when you first plow under any plant material, the mycelial growth of fungi and oomycetes, which are disproportionately pathogenic, will jump onto that material. So the early decomposition stages, you tend to have a lot of this fungal growth. So what you need is 4 to 6 weeks between plow down and planting. And this is a rule of thumb that we use here in the north central states, again, where moisture and temperature regimes differ. This time can be shortened or lengthened, where the general rule is the more water and the more temperature, higher temperature you have, the faster the decomposition rate will be. And you want to avoid having your cover crops go to seed in most cases, and this can be a particular problem if weather delays the crop destruction, whether you're crimping or plowing it under, of buckwheat and rye. And so again, this is one of the risks that one takes when one takes on cover crops, because if you cannot control the cover crop growth before seeding, then you've added a potential weed to your system. Okay, so that sort of lays out the general concepts that are applicable and the resources that one can use to get more specific details on the uses of cover crops, their risks and their benefits. And now I'd like to turn to 2 recent studies that we've conducted at Ohio State University to provide some additional information that's up to date that expands our understanding of the microbiological changes that occur when one uses cover crops, and also how we might use that information to change our management of cover crops in the future. So the first study that I would like to talk about was funded by the Organic Transitions program of the USDA. And the goal of that project was to assess the costs and benefits of different cropping strategies to manage transitional organic vegetable production. And here we have a picture of the on-station field site where we were looking at 4 treatments. And this is for the 3-year period between the end of conventional management and the transition to certified organic management. And what we were looking at were the costs and benefits of using tilled fallow, field vegetables, mixed hay cover cropping, or high tunnel vegetable cropping as a way of managing that transition both ecologically and economically. And today I'm going to focus in on the discussion of the plant and soil health impacts of the different treatments. And I'd like to point out that this was a cooperative effort by a number of researchers here at Ohio State University. So the results from a soil standpoint were twofold. The first was that the main treatments did not significantly affect soil chemistry after 3 years. As I mentioned, there is the potential for having greater availability of phosphorus because you have more of the soil profile ramified with plant roots. But in this particular silt loam soil, the availability of phosphorus was not dramatically changed. In fact, was not observed to significantly change regardless of how we managed the transition. The one exception was the high tunnel treatment, and this was because we had covered the soil. We used drip irrigation, and as such, we had less decomposition, particularly where we were adding compost, which was a secondary treatment. Because the compost had an elevated pH, the soil pH increased, and the extractable calcium and manganese, as well as the soil organic matter, continued to accumulate over the 3-year period, such that we actually had an increase of soil pH from 6.4 to nearly 7.4 in that 3-year time period, and an increase in soil organic matter from about 1% to 4.5%. The increases in soil carbon are noted here, and the soil fertility also was impacted by the compost, where we were seeing accumulations of 2 to 3 times as much soil phosphorus on a parts per million level and up to 5 times that level in potassium. So if you are transitioning, one of the take-home messages from this study is that you can use standard rates of compost additions that will elevate your soil fertility. Being a plant pathologist, I focused my work on the soil health assessments. So we collected soils from all the plots, and we assessed plant growth under controlled conditions, and subsequently in the field on 2 test crops, soybean and tomato. And this was because we were interested in assaying for changes in the functional microbial communities and the balance between pathogenic organisms that would slow down the growth and development of the cash crop regardless of the species of the cash crop. And so we determined the relative effects of soil-borne disease potential on these 2 test crops. So if we look first at soybean, the 3 graphs on the right represent the 3 sample times that we removed soil from the field, brought them under controlled conditions, and then we assayed the total amount of damping off. Now this is a seedling bioassay, but it is representative of the type of stresses that growing roots of not only young but also mature plants might experience throughout the growing season. And what you can see, first of all, is that the level of disease pressure changes, where the higher bars indicate a high level of disease. And so early in the season, we had a relatively low amount of disease pressure, and that progressed as the season went on. But if you look at the different treatments, and the plus C refers to plus compost, the pattern that keeps showing up here is that the cover crop hay treatment, which was a mixed species hay of both cereal and legumes, had the lowest amount of disease pressure at all time points, and in fact had significantly lower disease also in the field the following year. So these effects that were encouraged by the use of the mixed hay cover crop persisted over a year-long period. If we go on to tomato, we saw a somewhat similar pattern, though the magnitude of the differences was not as dramatic, but again, the majority of the times we were seeing the greatest benefit being conferred by the hay treatment during the transition period. So these assays were done during the 2nd and 3rd year of transition, and the field assays were actually done in the summer following certification. So how do we interpret these results? Well, if you think about two different plants, one that's growing under the hay cover cropping, and it seems to be healthier than one that did not experience the hay cover cropping, we can model what's going on the roots as a mix of microorganisms where the balance tends to be towards pathogenic on the less vigorous plants and towards a balanced community which has more antagonists on the healthier plants. And by using molecular methods that I won't go into in detail, we're able to assay the community profiles of the healthy and diseased plants to figure out which antagonist populations were promoted by the use of the mixed hay cover cropping. So what this involved was, again, taking the plants from our bioassays, isolating DNA, and amplifying markers for different species of organisms, and to do a whole bunch of fancy statistics on these profiles of the different organismal groups. This led ultimately to the identification and the isolation from the mixed hay species roots of organisms that belong to a unique group called Mitsuaria. Now, this was really remarkable because Mitsuaria belongs to a larger group of beta proteobacteria which have not been well studied and not frequently isolated. And in fact, the closest relative had been previously isolated only on a seaweed in the Pacific Ocean. So no one had seen these organisms on plants or in soils before, but they were enriched and brought to the fore by this mixed hay cover cropping. Now, when we bioassayed these particular organisms, we found that they were actually able to suppress different plant pathogens. Here we have Pythium ephenodermatum and Rhizoctonia solani as our test pathogens, and we have soybeans and tomato plants that were either treated with a pathogen only and had a high level of disease, or the seedlings were treated with the Mitsuaria bacteria, and you saw that the disease was significantly reduced. Not to the level of the natural senescence that one sees in roots grown in soil, but significantly reduced from the levels of the pathogen only. This is an indication that these bacteria can significantly contribute to the biological control of these two different pathogens, and it's quite remarkable because it's active on two very dissimilar cash crops. So in summary, the mixed species cover cropping showed that there was minimal effects of the plants on soil fertility relative to the other ways one could treat the soil that include that till fallowing, which is another way that people use to try to bring down the weed seed bank before they go into certified organic production. And that the mixed hay cover cropping enhanced suppressiveness of soil microbial communities relative to the other transitional treatments. And even the improvements of the compost additions did not affect the soil suppressiveness in this particular field test. There was a great addition of fertility, and that did boost overall yields in those fields, but they still suffered more from root diseases than the plots that had been treated with the mixed hay cover crop. And the microbiological study has shown that there are new, yet to be discovered organisms that we argue might be farmed as microbial inoculants. And I want you to keep this in mind as I talk about the follow-up study, which we began in 2009. So the next study that I want to discuss deals with the hypothesis that mixed species cover crops provides greater disease suppression than single cover crops. And this hypothesis was developed in response to our observation that the use of organic field vegetables in a standard rotation, but still planted in monoculture, did not give us the same degree of suppressiveness as the mixed hay cover crops did. So our goals were twofold in this study, and this is a multi-state study funded by the Organic Research and Extension Initiative of the USDA. The first was to assess knowledge gaps of growers related to cover crops and microbial inoculants as they relate to vegetable disease suppression. And the second was to evaluate the effects of mixed species green manures or cover crops relative to single species to determine if, in fact, this idea that mixed species cover cropping can lead to greater suppressiveness to soil-borne disease potential and therefore buffer the grower against those environmental conditions which predispose their crops to disease better than a single cover crop species. So with regards to the first goal, we set about developing a mental models approach where we identified perceptions about the nature of soil-borne diseases in organic vegetable production, their relationship to microbiology, in discussions with both academic experts, extension professionals, and growers. And from that mental model, we developed a survey, and that was designed to assess the knowledge base and identify gaps in grower knowledge so that we could fill those gaps either with new experiments that addressed those previously unidentified concerns or to provide appropriate educational materials. The topical focus, as I mentioned, was cover crops and disease management, but also inoculant and biopesticide use. We got 100 respondents from 6 different states. Most of those were vegetable farmers, and most of those listed tomato as their crop with the biggest disease problems. So the focus of our field research then was on tomato diseases and how they respond to different cover crops. In the survey, diseases were noted as a significant factor limiting production potential on these farms. With regards to cover crops, the large majority of growers reported that they used cover crops and that they were already using mixed species cover crops, though most of them were doing it on the premise that the addition of the legume into the cover crop would help build the nitrogen for their overall soil fertility. The perceived benefits of the cover crops, those that we had outlined in the first part of this talk, varied greatly by grower and also their cover crop choice. So there was a real spectrum of understanding of what the different cover crops can bring to a soil system. And the significant limitations to the effective use of cover crops were noted, and these included seed and equipment cost. Again, $10 to $50 per acre is what you'll spend in cover crop seed, depending on the type of cover crop you use. The yield loss due to delayed planting and short growing seasons were the most significant limitations that were experienced, with over 40% of the growers strongly agreeing that those were the downsides that they had experienced in their own uses of cover crops. A significant number also pointed out the added fuel cost and limited growing options that they felt they had for their areas, as well as problems with germination and establishment. With regards to microbial inoculants, nearly half of the organic growers reported that they had used microorganisms and/or biopesticides, with over 40% using each type of product. The inoculants that were chosen were generally rhizobial inoculants used for cover crops, but interestingly, very few of them noted that they used those inoculants for their cover crops. And it would seem that if they find value, and certainly there are plenty of studies that highlight that there is value in inoculating cash crop legumes with rhizobium, you would think that they would want to be using them on their cover crops, but that was not the case. The use of biopesticides was mainly for foliar diseases and pests, and this is partly a reflection that most growers don't pay much attention to soil-borne diseases unless they see dramatic yield losses relative to previous years. Most of the growers felt that the cost justified the use. However, most of them waited until after symptom appearance to make applications, and this is one of the downsides of misunderstanding the utility of these types of inputs, because most of them are preventative and inoculative, and if you wait until you see symptoms, there's already an established infection, and so they tend not to be as useful. So that's where the understanding was of those different ways of managing diseases when you are working with cover crops. Let's turn now to the actual field experiments that we've done. We've done field trials in 3 states, in Ohio, New York, and Maryland, for a total of 12 site years of data. We've been comparing single versus mixed cover crops, again followed by fresh market tomato cash crop, and we've looked at a variety of different cover crops alone and in combination. Again, the choice of cover crop varied by location and field because the needs expressed by the growers in those fields were different. I did want to show a couple of pictures of the type of good stand establishment that you can get with the different cover crops. On the top here we have a mixed species hay where the vetch and rye are mixed in, and the growth was very good the following spring. And here we have the tillage radish in that year that I said that you could hardly see the soil cover, but the Winterkill is quite substantial with this crop, and this is what it looked like the following spring. It was basically muddy all through the surface, but the compaction problem had been dissipated. So the results of these trials to date have shown considerable year-to-year variation in field performance of the cover crops at each location. Here in Ohio, as I mentioned, due to weather delays, we were not able to get good establishment in 2010, and we were able to have timely planting in 2011, and therefore our subsequent growth of the cover crops was quite different, and our success in terms of being able to incorporate the desired amount of biomass into the soil differed tremendously from year to year. So not surprisingly, the response of the cash crop to cover crop additions was dependent on that timing of incorporation and soil type. Again, weather delays in New York required a late plow-in, and so the time between plowing in the fresh cover crop and the transplanting was decreased to less than 3 weeks, and not surprisingly, where there had been a large amount of biomass incorporation of the cover crop, you had less transplant vigor early on in the season. And while it did not significantly reduce yields by the end of the season in terms of total marketable yield, there was a period through flowering that the difference in growth suggested that if the harvest period had not had optimal growing conditions, there would have been a significant yield loss due to that missed time transplanting. Differences in root health and disease suppression tended to be of small magnitude and unfortunately of limited predictability. And what that means is that while the use of cover crops trended towards having healthier plants that yielded more marketable fruit compared to no cover crops, and mixed species cover crops tended to trend better than single species cover crops, those differences were not significant in most site years of this test. So when you look at cover crops and the benefits that they can confer, these short-term assessments are going to suggest that the benefits are fairly small, But I'd argue that in the long term, those small benefits do accumulate, and you would probably see a healthier system on much longer time frames. So one of the take-home messages for those who are transitioning into organic agriculture is don't get discouraged too early and steer away from the use of cover crops if the first few seasons you aren't seeing dramatic results. It's a challenge to make that transition successfully, to being able to manage these rotations effectively, and Mother Nature, of course, often limits you in what and when you can do it in the field. So our next steps will be to quantify the overall costs and benefits of the mixed species versus single cover crops, because I gave you, again, trends that I can say are statistically not significant, but those trends are of sufficient magnitude that they do turn out into real dollars in terms of return on investment, and that economic analysis is still in process. And then this year we are also going back to our understanding of that problem associated with the initial turn-in of the fresh organic matter, and we're looking to see whether or not cover crops can act as a vehicle for delivering beneficial microbial inoculants. And the idea is to take these bacteria, which we know can suppress the phytopathogenic fungi and oomycetes, spray them onto the cover crop in an organically acceptable way, and because they are metabolically active and preemptively located on the digestible biomass, hopefully encourage a natural bloom of these beneficials that will suppress that initial bloom of phytopathogens, therefore decreasing the time that one can see between the plow down and the planting and transplanting of the cash crop. So again, trying to use the cover crop inoculated with beneficial bacteria to provide greater disease control and more flexibility for growers in terms of their management of their cash crop timing. So these are the summary points that I made for the organic transition study. And for the second study, the cover crops have been shown to be a useful tool for enhancing transitions to certified organic production. I have said, as many others have, that farmers need to weigh the benefits and risks of cover crops to use them successfully, and that successful cover crop management requires a lot of planning and flexibility and timing of operations. And this sometimes is not possible, particularly for those people who are farming part-time. Our new research is providing a better understanding of how to manage cover crops for maximum benefit. We do see benefits of mixed cover crops, including better soil health if used over the transition period. And when comparing cover crops, differences in disease suppressiveness do tend to be small when comparing mixed versus single species cover crops. And so these reasonable options need to be weighed as being somewhat better than doing nothing at all, but not so much better than each other. So, for example, you're healthier when you eat an apple or an orange or some cantaloupe, but to say which one of those is better than the other is often hard to figure out without knowing more about the specifics of your individual health. And so is the same with the choice of cover crops for soil health. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge those people who have been involved with this work. My collaborators here at Ohio State, particularly Sally Miller and Matt Kleinhens in the Horticulture Department, and Christine Smart and Kate Everts at Cornell and University of Maryland, and George Norton's been working us on the economic analyses. The funding was provided by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the people in my lab doing the heavy lifting out in the field were Sunyan Park, Xiaoqing Rong, and Soledad Benitez. And with that, I'll be happy to finish up and take any questions.
Thank you very much, Brian. We're about to start our question and answer session. And Move on to our questions, and we have one question about that mental model study that you were doing, and someone wondered whether the survey data is going to be published somewhere and where they might be able to find it.
Yes, actually, the survey data is going to be split into two different publications. The first will be related to the use of cover crops and soil-borne disease management in organic vegetables. And then the second will be specific to the use of microbial inoculants and biopesticides. We have not identified a publication outlet for that in a peer-reviewed journal, but those results will be summarized within the next year.
Okay. In terms of rolling and crimping, we have some questions about that. One person would like you to briefly explain how that works, and someone else asked about when you are not plowing the cover crop but using it as a mulch, in the case of rolling and crimping rye, for example, does there need to be a waiting period between crimping and planting?
Okay. So there's a couple of ways of creating the mulch, but the most effective way that I've seen is using a roller device, which actually looks like a little bit of a steamroller. It tends to have an edge to it, and there's several types that you can find on the internet. There's been a lot of work with this done at the Rodale Institute, and we've done some work here at Ohio State. And this implement's actually put on the front part of the tractor, and so when the ryegrass is at the appropriate growth stage, when it gets crimped by this device, it will stay down. And there have been studies that have actually shown that on the back end of the tractor, you can go ahead and put your planter if you have a large seeded crop. And so if you have corn or soybeans or something that can grow through a mulch effectively, you can actually crimp and roll and plant with the same operation. I haven't seen anyone use this for vegetable production in that way, though I have seen them actually crimp the cover crop and then go through with a bed maker, which in the process of making the beds clears away a section of that crimped cover, and then they overlaid that with plastic.
Okay. Let's see, here's another question. How do you establish cover crops or forages in a no-till organic system with dense sod from forages and weeds?
I have never seen anyone establish a no-till cover crop in that sort of situation. If you have a dense sod where you've got weeds and pasture, your choices are either to mow it down and plant a very competitive cover crop into that soil, though I don't know how successful that would be. I have much more experience working with plowing down under conventional tillage, at the very least disking in, and it may be possible that you could do some strip tillage depending on the type of weed problem that you have and the type of cash crop that you're going to grow subsequently.
Okay, the next two questions are from people in short seasons. So the first one is, because we get cold weather here on Prince Edward Island, Canada, which are the best cover crops that will die naturally in cold weather?
Okay. For that, again, I would say that the best resource for that is to look at that SARE guide on managing cover crops profitably. When you have very short growing seasons, it is a real challenge to use cover crops because the amount of time that you have to establish and grow sufficient biomass to get the types of benefits is very limited, because you're really talking about from August through your first frosts, and then you either have a winter-killed cover crop like the tillage radish, or you have something that survives the winter like a winter rye, but you still need to have a sufficient growth period between the first thaws and the timing of your cash crop. And I know that as a general rule, the further north you go, the less likely you'll be able to use cover crops effectively. But I would have to defer to experts more in your region because I'm not that familiar with the growing conditions or the cash crops that you use there in Prince Edward Island.
Yeah, you kind of answered the next question. I guess it wasn't a question, but it was a comment, and this person is talking about how in northern Wisconsin they don't have 4 weeks between plow down and the planting. The new crop just doesn't have a long enough growing season. So.
And that's one of the reasons why people experience very inconsistent responses to their cover crops, is that particularly in the north central regions, maybe 1 out of every 2 years, if you're lucky 1 out of every 4 years, you're going to have a situation where you just will not be able to plow down your cover crop in a timely way and let it decompose to the necessary level that you do not get that green bridge effect. And this is why, in fact, we wanted to look at cover crops as a vehicle for delivering microbial inoculants into the soil system as a way of managing the microorganisms and managing those blooms like we manage the timing of our planting of larger crops, so that we don't get that kind of disease pressure in the short term, and therefore maybe extend the range to which we can profitably use cover crops further north.
How does cereal rye inhibit the germination of, wheat seed? How quickly does this benefit fade once rye has been tilled in or crimped to kill?
Right. So the allelopathy has to do with chemicals that are released from the leaves themselves, and the residual of that tends to be several weeks. And so again, the prevailing moisture conditions, the number and frequency of rain events will determine how long that allelopathy works. And so the real benefit of doing the crimping is that you get both the chemical allelopathic effect, which slows the germination of those small-seeded weed seeds, and you are blocking out the light. So you're kind of dealing a double whammy to the smaller-seeded weed bank. But again, you're going to get your best effects with using a large-seeded cash crop being planted into that, and you are going to have to be wary of perennial weeds such as thistle and giant ragweed, which can penetrate through that mulch and are less sensitive to the allelopathic chemicals of cereal rye.
Okay. Here's another question about whether there's a listing of species or varieties that are better adapted to certain regions as well as uses. Would that be found in the SARE publication that you mentioned?
Yes, it would.
Okay.
And the other thing to do is to recognize that there's been a lot of work at a lot of different universities looking at locally adapted cover crops, and so it may be that your local College of Agriculture actually has done an experiment recently and can provide recommendations that are tailored to your region.
Speaking of experiments, this question, I believe, refers to the study that you were talking about later in the presentation about comparing mixed species and single-species cover crops. If you could just talk a bit about your plot size and replications and rotations and insights for further improvement of that technique.
Sure. With regards to the experimental design, we were using 20-foot by 10-foot or 20-foot by 20-foot plot sizes. These are small plots. We were hand seeding them because we were working with different combinations of cover crops, and that's probably as small as you can go. If I had to do it all over again, I would probably do it on a much larger scale, but by focusing on the smaller plots, we were able to get a little bit clearer picture of the variation that's present in an individual field in terms of the microbiology.
Okay, here's another person from eastern Canada. Most cover crops winter kill with the exception of winter grains and slow-growing hay crops. When using cover crops to return nutrients to the soil, such as veg, peas, or oats, etc., am I losing these nutrients over the winter when they winter kill, or is there still a benefit to the following year's crops?
Unless you have very sandy soil and a lot of moisture, you're going to retain most of that benefit through. There's not a lot of decomposition that happens when the soils are very cold. So what you get with the winter kill is a pause in the decomposition of the cover crop, and it's really the time between the first thaws and your planting that determines how much of the nutrients you might lose. Again, if you have flooded soils, you'll lose more through denitrification. If you have sandy soils, you might lose more through leaching. But if you have a good loam soil that has a fairly deep topsoil profile, then you'll retain most of that for the succeeding past crop.
Okay, here's a question about whether it's necessary to rotate cover crops to maintain their ability to reduce pest pressures.
Yeah. One of the things that organic highlights is that longer rotations tend to preclude the development of epidemic pest or disease complexes. And so to the extent that you are able to vary the type of cover crop you use from season to season, the more likely you are to avoid the types of problems that were just described.
Okay, here's a question about whether or not you've experimented with using raw milk as the inoculant on cover crop.
Okay, I didn't hear the question.
Whether or not you've experimented with using raw milk as the inoculant on cover crop.
Okay, raw milk. So there are a variety of organic amendments that one can apply to soil. However, which they are incorporated into the soil depends on the solubility. So if you're talking about something like milk, what will happen is that the nutrients get decomposed very quickly and they spread through the microbial community.
I have Brian's website up on the screen here if you'd like to copy that address down in case you would like to communicate with him. He did offer very generously for people to communicate with him after the webinar. And if you have additional questions about organic farming and cover crops, I also encourage you to use our resources at extension.org/organic_production. And there's also an Ask an Expert service there that you can use to ask questions about organic farming. And I'll pull up those links as well. Here we go. Okay, and you can also find the slides from the webinar, and we'll have the recording there as well. And I'll pass along your questions to Brian, and we can post some additional resources on that page up at the top. For example, the SARE guides for those who have questions about selecting cover crops. Well, it looks